I never know when that song is over. I like it, but thank you. Well, thank you for being here tonight. As I've said, we're going to begin tonight talking about evolution. I don't know how many weeks we're going to talk about this and really where we'll go next, but I'm excited to do this. I read a book a couple of years ago by Ken Ham. I know several of you are familiar with Ken Ham if you've been to the Noah's Ark encounter in Kentucky and then in Ohio. Then that's what they do. That's Ken Ham. But he wrote a book called Already Gone. And for years when I was in student ministry, I made the mistake. I thought I was correct at the time, but I would talk about how our teenagers are about to go off to college. And if we're not careful, if we don't do our job, then by the time they get to college, those professors start working on them. And that's when they end up leaving the church or walking away from their faith. And I thought that's where it was. I thought the divide was from high school to college. But in his book, Already Gone, Ken Ham says they're gone by middle school. They may physically be in church, but they're already gone. We've lost them at a much younger age than we think. And his reasoning was this. He said, we teach them when they're in children's church. We tell them, like TJ learned today about Jonah and the whale. Fantastic. I'm glad we teach them that. It's fun to talk about the whale, and he had this whole little book he had made, and there's Jonah inside the rib cage of a whale praying, and that's great. We teach them about the coat of many colors. We teach them Daniel in the lion's den, and all these disconnected, isolated stories that are true. We teach them these things. And then occasionally something like creation might come up, and we might say God made Adam and God made Eve, or God made the whole world. And that's really about as deep as we really get with it. And we're not doing much better in our pulpits. We might say, Darwinism is not right, and evolution is not true, and God made the world. But that's as far as we take the issue. Meanwhile, what do our kids hear 6 other days a week? In school, they hear millions of years, Charles Darwin, millions of years. They turn on the TV and you sit down to watch your Saturday morning cartoons. TJ loves dinosaurs. He watches these dinosaur cartoons and they all begin millions of years ago. And you are bombarded with this from the minute you wake up to the minute they go to bed. And if we don't realize that as their parents or grandparents, then we are become so naive that we don't realize what our kids are truly up against. So here's what happens to kids in middle school, according to Ken Ham, and I think he's hit the nail on the head. They say, my Sunday school teacher, my children's church worker, my pastor, they're great people, and they know this book, and they love God, and they mean well. But my teacher at school is trained in science. The people that made these documentaries, they're much smarter. The people that study dinosaur bones, they know what they're talking about when it comes to dinosaur bones. So somewhere, someone is right and someone is wrong. And as much as I like my pastor, or my Sunday school teacher, or my parents that love the Lord, they're right about the Beatitudes, they're right about the 10 Commandments, but they just don't know what they're talking about when it comes to who made the world. And it's not personal, they don't mean to insult us, but in their little minds, this is the struggle. My teacher says, and the book says, and the Discovery Channel says, and my parents say, and my Sunday school teacher says, and there's a conflict. And so what they have concluded in their precious young minds is that we mean well, we just don't know what we're talking about. And I have felt burdened to begin this series for us to talk about some of these things because, as I said in my prayer, this is the battleground. If Satan can win on who created us, then he can win the entire thing. And we must stand our ground on this issue. But what do? Our kids say, well, my teacher said it's millions of years. What do you say? Well, you just got to believe the Bible. Nobody believes the Bible more than I do, but is that always enough? I think we have to be able to defend what we believe in the face of these attacks that our children are getting on all sides. And it's not just our children, you're getting it too. You can't watch a show, you can't watch Shark Week, you can't watch anything, go into a museum without hearing millions of years. So tonight I just want us to talk about evolution and where it all began. Next week, we're going to talk about the age of the earth, and then we're going to look at some science over the coming weeks. I'm going to try not to be boring, okay? I'm not a scientist, and so I don't want to bore you with a bunch of scientific facts. I want to keep it interesting, and I want to try to present all of this to where we can all grab it and hopefully remember it, and then hopefully have something to say next time we're lied to about millions of years. But tonight, let's just talk about how we got here, what evolution is, where it all began, and some simple things that we can say to come back at it. First of all, we hear this all the time. Smart people believe in evolution. If you understand science, then you believe in evolution as well. Science is incredible, and the more we learn, the more it has proven evolution. And the more that we prove evolution, the less we need God. The less we need God as the creator, the less we need him to be our Lord and Savior, and then we can finally remove him as the judge. By the way, that's the ultimate goal. No one wants a judge. The only way to get rid of him is to remove him as creator. But smart people believe in evolution. If you don't believe in evolution, you just don't get science. If you're just clinging to your Bible, you just don't understand. Smart people believe in evolution. Why? We have all the proof. We have all the fossils. We have all the bones. The science is settled. The verdict is in. And we got here through random chance billions of years ago, not as special creations by God. Have you ever heard that? Because I hear it all the time, and frankly, I'm sick of it. Smart people believe in evolution. If you don't, you're just not very smart. Well, tonight I just want to share a couple of quotes with you as we get started by some idiots that must not have known anything about science. Can I share some quotes from a couple of idiots that were too stupid to understand that evolution is true? Cindy, can you put the first one up on the board, please? The first idiot that did not understand science. He said this, "I give you thanks, Creator God, that you have given me this joy in thy creation. I rejoice in the works of your hands. I have used all the talents that you have lent to my spirit." The idiot that didn't get science that said that is Johannes Kepler. He's the person who's come up with the law of planetary motion. But yet he says, "I give you thanks, O Creator God." He recognized that with all that he learned in science, he gave God the glory for teaching him and giving him the mind to grasp these things. Another person who obviously didn't get science, the next quote, he says, "We account the scriptures of God to be the most sublime philosophy. I find more sure marks of authenticity in the Bible than in any profane history whatsoever." The bonehead that didn't understand science and said that was Isaac Newton. Let's put up one more, if you will. This person said, "All things proceed according to the artificer's design." The capital A in artificer or inventor lets us know that Robert Boyle was speaking about God. By the way, Robert Boyle is known as the father of physical chemistry. That's why it drives me crazy when they say smart people believe in evolution. If you don't believe in evolution, you just don't get science. Well, tell that to the father of physical chemistry, the one who came up with the laws of planetary motion, and Sir Isaac Newton, who's contributed as much to science as probably any other individual. Brilliant people with a mind for science, and yet they gave all the glory to God and believe that God's word is true. And you might say, well, they weren't talking about the book of Genesis. They might have liked the Psalms or the Beatitudes, but they didn't get the book of Genesis. Well, there's a botanist by the name of John Ray. This one's not on the screen, but he wrote a book called The Wisdom of God Manifested in the Works of Creation. And here's what he said. He credited Genesis 1 with leading him to introduce the first definition of species coming from reproduction after their own kind. By studying Genesis 1, he came to this same conclusion. The book of Genesis led this botanist to write this groundbreaking book. So I invite you to Genesis chapter 1 tonight. We're going to look at a few verses there, and it's going to be in a few more minutes, but I just would like you to have Genesis 1 handy when we get there. And I like what John Ray said there, what he wrote in his book. But while you're turning there, and it shouldn't take you too long, it's the first page. But while you're turning to Genesis 1, I want to share another quote from Carl Linnaeus. He's the man who's credited with having discovered biological taxonomy. Carl Linnaeus said that he used the Genesis account of creation to teach him to classify animals after their kind. We refer to this as taxonomy today. And that's what we see in Genesis 1. We see each thing reproducing after its kind. So after reading Genesis 1, the man who discovered biological taxonomy said, there's something to this, and we still use his work today in biology. And so he credited the Genesis account with helping him arrive at this theory that is settled science today. So we've seen some quotes from people that are God-fearing, Bible-believing Christians that believe in science. They believe that God is the creator of life. Now let's contrast that with a quote from Charles Darwin. We're familiar with Charles Darwin. He's the one in 1859 who wrote his book titled On the Origin of Species. Although he plagiarized most of his grandfather's book, he did not come up with this idea himself. Darwin's grandfather wrote a book titled Zoonomia, And Charles Darwin swore up and down for his whole life, no, I didn't plagiarize it, I didn't read his book. And then finally, at the end of his life, he said, I might have been influenced by my grandfather's book a little more than I let on. A little more. He plagiarized large sections of it, entire paragraphs and pages, copied verbatim from his grandfather. So he was more than influenced by it. He frankly stole his grandfather's book and called it his own. But all that aside, here's a quote, and I want you to understand this quote that you see on the screen from Darwin. This is so important that we can wrap our minds around this quote. He said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ or organism existed which could not have possibly have formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, then my theory would absolutely break down. So Charles Darwin is giving us something to test his theory by. He says, you can either prove me right or prove me wrong based on this one thing. If you can find Exhibit A and point to this and say, this thing right here could not have evolved by numerous, successive, and slight modifications, then my theory is absolutely false. It has broken down. So tonight, I submit to you that Charles Darwin's theory has in fact broken down. What I intend to do tonight, hopefully not without boring anybody, but what I want to prove to you tonight is that there are things that could not have evolved apart from successive, numerous, and slight modifications. So don't take my word for it. Those are Charles Darwin's words. We will evaluate his theory based on his criteria on things that we know today that he could not have known in 1859. But this is Darwinism in a nutshell, right? Everything you see got here by numerous, slight, and successive modifications made to itself. No rational person would ever believe that in the beginning there was nothing, and then boom, there's people. Human beings walking around in all of our sophistication, walking upright and possessing language, and all of our faculties about us. Nobody would ever believe that. But that's not what evolution says. Evolution says there was nothing, and then boom, there's pond scum. There's microscopic bacteria growing in a warm pond somewhere. That's Darwinism. And those tiny, microscopic, simple, to use Darwin's words, these simple living things, or these simple cells, then slowly began to clump themselves together, and over a lot of time, those tiny things got bigger. Those simple things became slightly more complex. How did it do it? Well, by numerous, slight, successive modifications. Nobody would believe that a cat lays down for a nap and wakes up as a dog. No rational person would believe that. But again, evolution does not say that. It's slight modifications. It's the tiniest little improvements that it enacts upon itself to move from simple to complex. That's what Charles Darwin teaches. And he said, if you can prove that that did not or could not happen, then my theory falls apart. Are you guys still with me? Do you understand what Darwin's saying and what we're seeking to do here tonight? To prove that you and I, and much less far simpler things than human beings, that we could not and did not evolve by numerous, slight, successive modifications made to ourselves. By the way, Darwin does not explain or even attempt to explain where those tiny things came from. The warm pond that he spoke of, he doesn't know where the warm pond came from, and he doesn't attempt to explain that. He doesn't know where the first living things came from, and he does not attempt to explain that. He has a major problem on his hand because Darwin does not explain how life came into being. He titled his book The Origin of Species, but that is a misnomer. He does not tell us the origin of life. He starts off with life is already here, it's small, here's how it got bigger. Only the Bible tells us in its first sentence, in the beginning God created. Charles Darwin can't do that for us. He cannot tell us the origin of life. He takes for granted life is already here. So let's set aside the fact that Darwin does not explain how life got here on this planet. He just says how it went from simple to complex. So, the smallest thing that Darwin could conceive of in the 1850s is the single cell, and we're going to talk about that single cell, what he called simple. Thank you, Cindy. You see on the screen, and I realize this is hard to see and you might not realize what you're looking at, but this is the cross section of a single cell. You remember cross sections from your textbook? Some of you students in your science class will say, here's a cross section. It would be like when you see someone take a coconut and karate chop it in half and you've got two halves of a coconut. That's a cross section. If you could neatly cut something directly in half and separate it and look inside it, that's a cross section. Now this is the cross section of a cell. You might say, okay, cool, there's a lot of stuff in there. What am I looking at? Well, again, don't take my word for what you see on the screen. I want to read to you from the book Total Truth by Nancy Percy. By the way, a fantastic book. But here's how she describes the cell that you're looking at. Remember, this is something we look at under a microscope. It is super tiny. She said each cell is akin to a miniature factory town, humming with power plants, automated factories, and recycling centers. In the nucleus is a cell library housing blueprints and plans that are copied and transported to factories, each of which is filled with molecular machines that function like computerized motors. The outside surface of the cell is studded with sensors, gates, pumps, and identification markers to regulate traffic coming in and out. Each cell's like a train station where tracks crisscross and yet never collide with each other. What happens inside the cell, something that we cannot see with our naked eye, it boggles the mind to know all of the sophistry, gosh, I got tongue-tied there, to know how sophisticated it is inside that cell. All these moving parts whizzing around, communicating with each other. It's almost like it has its own mail system, where something will put out its outgoing mail and here comes the moving vehicle to pick it up and to carry it to the next part of the cell and then pick up their mail and bring it back to the other parts of the cell. All of these things are moving around day in and day out inside the life of these simple cells. Francis Crick is the man who discovered DNA. Francis Crick said this: the cell is thus a miniature factory bustling with rapid, organized chemical activity. Francis Crick said these words: nature invented the assembly line years before Henry Ford. Charles Darwin had no idea what he was dealing with when he said the simple cells came out of the pond and these simple cells are what grew into the complex. This is the simplest thing that we can find. And ask yourself, is it truly simple, or is it far more complex than we ever knew before we were able to study it? For Charles Darwin in the 1850s, he knew nothing of molecular or microbiology. To him, this was just a blob. To him, it was like a jelly-like structure that had no sophistication about it. It wasn't smart. It was just a hunk of gunk that grew in a pond, and that is what eventually evolved into life. Well, now we know just how complex it really is. Consider the flagellum. You know what a flagellum is? It's the whip-like tail that some microscopic bacteria has. The flagellum is what a single cell uses to get around. It looks like a whip, but it works like the oar in a rowboat. It can change directions. It can allow the cell to twist and turn and go different ways. And it's the engine that moves around these cells. In the human eye, it might look like something like an eyelash. But when we study it, here's what we find. Cindy, if you'd be so kind. Thank you. This is what the flagellum looks like when we truly break it down. To the naked eye, it looks like a tiny, tiny hair or a whip. But when we look at it under a microscope, it looks like something that was manufactured in one of our engineering plants. I know you probably can't read all the tiny words up there that describe it, but I just want to describe for you what we see when we dissect the flagellum. It's a motor that can go in both forwards and reverse. It can move around at a speed of 100,000 RPMs, or revolutions per minute. 100,000 RPMs. It has at least 40 operational parts, including a drive shaft, O-rings, a hook joint, and a stator. Again, nature beat Henry Ford to the punch with this invention that we see here, the flagellum. So now, after taking this in and thinking about the cross-section of the cell, can we return to Charles Darwin's quote from a minute ago? The next one, Cindy, if you could put that up. We've already read it. But again, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have formed by numerous, successive, and slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Charles Darwin was thinking about these tiny little blobs that he thought were simple cells. And these simple cells then could evolve themselves into complex cells. And if they could not be found to have done that, then his theory breaks down. Well, this is what's referred to today as Darwin's black box. Black boxes are things that we cannot see inside. Darwin could not see inside a cell, so cells are referred to as Darwin's black box. In 1996, Michael Behe wrote a book by that title, Darwin's Black Box, and in there he argues this very point. Darwin did not know what was inside the cell. It was a black box to him. Now that we know what's in it, we realize that what he called simple is far too complex to have simply evolved. And if the simple cell could not have evolved because of its complexity, then we cannot have more complex things evolve by simple things. So Darwin's entire premise falls apart. Complex things like you and I, which are considered to be the highest evolutionary species, we're the most evolved out of everything. If we could not have evolved by these simple things being put together because the simple things are too complex to have evolved, then his theory falls apart exactly as he said, testing Darwin according to his own standard, his own metric. Measure me by this, he says. Measure my theory by this one thing that you see on the screen. It falls apart. So I believe tonight that his theory has fallen apart. In Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box, he gives us not only what I just shared about the cell, but he also has coined this phrase that you need to know tonight. And this simple phrase, these two words, irreducible complexity. Have you ever heard that before? Irreducible complexity. You might say, this is science, it's boring, my brain hurts. No, stay with me. This is easy and I know you can grasp it. I'm not a scientist, but I want you to understand irreducible complexity. Reduce just means to make something smaller. We divide a number by 2, we reduce it down. And then complexity, we're talking about complex things. Irreducible complexity is the idea that says that there are some things that are reduced down as far as they can go. They cannot be reduced any further and still work. To think about irreducible complexity, is that thunder? Oh, I love thunder. I hope we get a good rainstorm tonight. But irreducible complexity is the idea then that we have the bare minimum amount of working parts for a complex thing to work. We cannot make it any smaller. We cannot take away one single thing. Otherwise, the whole thing stops working. Michael Behe's analogy was the simple mousetrap. And we can all wrap our minds around the mousetrap. And Cindy, if you would put that up, please. Bingo. You probably have one of these in your basement or somewhere in your house right now. This is the simplest mousetrap that there is. It's a block of wood, there's a spring, there's a piece of metal, and then if you want to add a piece of cheese or peanut butter or whatever, I recommend peanut butter, but you can put whatever you want in there. The bait is up to you. But that's it. That is the bare minimum. There are far more complex mousetraps out there, but this thing is as simple as it gets. But you can't put a block of wood down in your basement and that block of wood start catching mice for you. And you say, man, that caught a few mice. I bet if I add a spring to it, I'll catch even more mice. And then you say, if I add a metal bar to clamp down, I'll catch even more mice. And hey, maybe I'll add a piece of cheese and then really see how many mice I can catch. No, the mousetrap doesn't work that way, right? They either all work, all the parts are working, or none of it works. You can't have a block of wood and a metal bar without a spring. If you don't have the spring, the block of wood doesn't do you any good. Now, we've got Victor's logo stamped on there. That would be the only thing that we can subtract from this mousetrap, and then it still work. So we could say this is not irreducibly complex because it has a logo someone stamped on there. So let's remove the logo, and now we've reached the place where we can say we cannot reduce it any further and have it still work. If you take away the spring, it no longer works, right? You agree with me on that? You take away the metal bar, it no longer works. You take away the block of wood, the springs can't connect to it, and it no longer works. This is irreducible complexity. So if we were to think about this mousetrap in evolutionary terms, in the beginning there was nothing, and then there was a big bang, and boom, we got a block of wood. And then millions of years later, that block of wood slowly evolved itself a metal bar. And then millions of years later, through slight, successive, numerous modifications, it evolved itself a spring. And then millions of years later, it evolved a piece of cheese, and finally we have a functioning mousetrap. That's what evolution says. Michael Behe says, no, it can't work that way. Irreducible complexity says you either have all of the working parts at the same time or none of it works. That wouldn't work with a mousetrap. How much more when we apply that to human beings? Imagine we say, here's a person who has a skeletal system, but nothing else. No, we need a muscular system. We need a nervous system. We need a digestive system. We need a reproductive system. We need all of these complex things working at the same time, or you don't have human life. You can't evolve a little bit today, and then in a million years evolve a little bit more through numerous, slight, successive modifications. It's all or nothing. Irreducible complexity says you don't just get to add millions of years and numerous modifications and say, oh, it works. You either have it all right now or you don't. An example of this is, I mentioned Shark Week earlier. I said you can't even watch Shark Week. When the paper comes out on Tuesday, if you get the newspaper, you'll see I wrote about this in my column for the week, but I mentioned watching Shark Week just a little while back, a week or so ago on TV. And while watching Shark Week, the announcer just says so matter-of-factly, this shark cannot digest fish, and so it evolved itself a special digestive tract, and now it can digest fish. And then just moves on to the next thing. And my immediate thought was, how did it eat before it evolved itself this special digestive tract? If it couldn't eat fish, and it only eats fish, it would have died of starvation before it evolved itself a digestive tract. That's irreducible complexity. It doesn't have the benefit of millions of years to slowly modify and add itself a digestive tract. Irreducible complexity says you either have it all or you have nothing. You don't get to slowly add to yourself over time. So this goes back to the whole concept of Darwin's black box. Darwin did not know these things. He did not understand how complex what he called the simple things truly were. And so if we realize that the simple cell could not have evolved a little tiny part. Remember all the descriptions of it? It's like a factory. It's humming around. It's moving information. It has recycling centers. It has moving parts. The cell had to have all at once been fully formed, or else it never would have existed. The simplest cell could not have evolved a little bit of itself and then later evolved a little bit of itself. It's either all or nothing. So here's the deal, guys. Life must have been formed spontaneously, all at once, fully formed. It's either that or it's nothing. Evolution must be thrown out the window because evolution does not say life got here spontaneously all at once, but no, Darwin says multiple successive slight modifications. So if you're in Genesis chapter 1, let's see if the Bible mentions life coming spontaneously. Genesis chapter 1, verse 20. And God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens. So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm, according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kind, livestock, and creeping things, and beasts of the earth according to their kind. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kind, and the livestock according to their kind, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God said that it was good. That's how it happened, and that's the only way it could have happened. How do we have these things that are so complex that they could not have evolved through slight, numerous, successive modifications? God said, let there be a horse, and there was a horse. God said, let there be a cow, and there was a cow. There is no other explanation for life coming from non-life except to have the artificer, the designer, the great architect, the creator God to step into our world and say, let there be, and then there was. But the scientists say, oh, only idiots who don't understand science believe that. The science is not on the evolutionist side. The science does not back up what they say. And this is why the key word for every evolutionist is time. The key word is time. Imagine somebody says, here's how we got here. There was nothing, boom, an explosion, here we all are. You'd say, that's science fiction. Oh yeah, no, of course it didn't happen like that. It happened over billions of years. And you say, oh, okay. Well, how is it any more probable to happen over billions of years? If it couldn't happen in a second, it couldn't happen in a billion years. If it's impossible now, it's impossible a billion years from now. But evolutionists so desperately need there to be time. It's the only thing that makes the impossible possible. Don't take my word for it. Can I share a quote with you from an evolutionary scientist by the name of Dr. George Wald? He said, time is in fact the hero of the plot. Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible. The improbable becomes probable, and the probable becomes virtually certain. One only has to wait. Time itself performs miracles. Folks, he's not joking. He's serious. An evolutionary scientist, given enough time, the impossible becomes possible, the improbable becomes probable, and the probable becomes virtually certain. One only has to wait, and time works miracles. You hold up this book and you say, I believe in a higher power. I believe in a God that created us. Oh, come on now. That's fairy tales. You believe in that stuff? We believe in science. And here's a scientist saying time works miracles. Evolutionists demand a scientific explanation, a natural explanation. They say, we can't entertain miracles in science. We can't prove God. So we set that aside and we look for a scientific answer. And here's a scientist saying time works miracles. What utter hypocrisy to tell us that we can't suggest God did it because science and miracles don't go along. But they can introduce the miracle of time and say, well, given enough time, the impossible becomes possible. That's a scientist saying that. You can't mention God, but time works miracles for me. Ladies and gentlemen, if 2 + 2 is 4, a billion years from now, it will still be 4. 2 + 2 does not become 5. No, give it time. It will become 5. Well, 100 years from now, it's still 4. A million years from now, it's still 4. A billion years from now, it's still 4. The impossible does not become possible. I don't care how much time you give it. And Charles Darwin never used the word billion. In Darwin's day, it was millions. Oh, millions of years. Well, now the more that we've learned, the more far-fetched evolution has become, the more they realize, millions isn't going to cut it anymore. We've got to make it billions of years. And so now evolutionists have evolved from millions of years to billions of years because time is the only way that they have a fighting chance. Randy Weissong, in his book, The Creation-Evolution Controversy, said, it is no secret that evolutionists worship at the altar of time. Time and chance is a two-headed deity. Life cannot arise from non-life, not today, not tomorrow, or not in a billion years. It's important that you and I understand just how much evolutionists need time to give themselves a fighting chance. They need it. Without it, it's dead on arrival. And so they have invented time out of thin air. They've done it in 2 ways, and we'll be done. Hang on. Y'all still with me? You still awake? 2 ways that they've invented time, and then we'll be done. First is through carbon dating, or C14 dating. They say, well, we've dated this fossil. It's millions of years old, and so we know that, and this is settled science. We dated that dinosaur bone, and we know what it is. Carbon dating. They say carbon dating all the time. Look, if carbon dating were sworn in as a witness, the judge would throw out its testimony, would order the jury to disregard the verdict because carbon dating is flawed. It's inadmissible. It's junk science, and it has been debunked over and over and over, but that has not stopped the textbooks from still putting it in there. Go home and find your kids' science textbooks and flip around, and you will find carbon dating. You will find that it is this many years old, and maybe there's a little superscription or a footnote, and you look that up, and it'll say, through carbon dating, it was found to be this. They know it's fraud, and they put it in there anyway. Look up, if you ever get on YouTube, look up Kent Hovind. He's one of the funniest guys, but Kent Hovind has done a lot of research with carbon dating. Kent Hovind finished his lunch one day of fried chicken. He's a Baptist. And so he got his chicken bones from dinner. And because he's a scientist, he sent them off to the lab to be carbon dated. He said, these are bones that I found when I was digging at such and such a place. And they sent it back and they told him it was this many years old. He took the same chicken bone, sent it to the same laboratory and said, I found this over here when I was digging over there. And they sent it back with a completely different age, off by millions of years. And that's what carbon dating will do. You can date it over and over and over, and you'll get 100 different dates that range in the hundreds of millions of years. It is junk science, but they lie to your kids every day, and your tax dollars put it in their textbooks. They need there to be time, and so they've invented it out of thin air. The next way they've done it is with the geologic columns. The most fascinating thing, because so many people do not realize how they're being duped with geologic columns, or the rock layers, they say. The geologic columns exist. Those are real. But here's what they say. Imagine you go on a tour, you go into a museum, and they show you the geologic columns, all these different layers, and they say, this layer is this many million years old, and this layer is this many million years old. And if you were to politely raise your hand and say, excuse me, how do you know how old each layer is? Oh, that's a great question. Well, we date the layer by the rocks that we found in it. They're called index fossils. We know that this layer is this old because all the fossils we found in it are 100 million years old, therefore the layer is 100 million years old. Makes sense, doesn't it? You continue your tour through the museum, and now you come upon these dinosaur bones, and they say, this dinosaur is 100 million years old. And you raise your hand and say, excuse me, how do you know how old that dinosaur is? Oh, that's a great question. We know how old the bones are because the rock layer we found them in is 100 million years old. So if the layer is 100 million years old, then everything we find in it must likewise be 100 million years old. That sounds good too. But what happens when you then merge those two things together? Cindy, one last time, if you don't mind. Thank you. This is a sketch of, obviously, the rock layer, the geologic columns. Can you read what it says on there? Maybe not. It says on there, layers date the fossils, and fossils date the layers. This is logical fallacy. But that's exactly what they do. They say, we know the layer is this old because the bone in it was this old. Well, how old is the bone? Well, we know the bone is this old because the layer it was in is this old. Where do the numbers come from? Thin air. They don't have a thing in the world to back up the numbers that they have submitted to you. They just made sure that both charts are consistent. The date of the rock layer matches the date of the rock itself, and then it looks like it's settled science. But it is built on a complete fabrication. They desperately need time, and that's how they've done it. They've just written it onto the chart and told you that it's true. And they will be the first to tell you. We know the layer is this age because of the rock. We know the rock's this age because of the layer. It's circular reasoning. They would not let us get away with that. Why should we let them get away with it? And so I want you to think about, as we begin to wrap it up here, that they are just trying to find time. So anytime you hear someone say, millions of years ago, understand, and they might not be lying to you, they may be deceived or duped themselves, but understand that this is not genuine science that has given them these numbers. Charles Darwin said that the more that we dig, the more we should find simple life, the farther down we go. Because if the first things to live were simple, and then gradually more complex, then we should find simpler things way down deep, and then more complex things at the top. In reality, we found the exact opposite to be true. The Cambrian explosion, it's called, was a discovery of many things, but what it did is it found the exact opposite of what Darwin said. Simpler things near the top and more complex near the bottom. That totally blows evolution out of the water because we have complex things that should not have evolved into existence yet in way down deep where they should not have been. So how do we explain all these things? How do we explain the fact that there are rock layers? They say, well, these formed, each one formed over millions of years, slowly formed over millions of years. Well, it could also be formed very, very quickly if something catastrophic happened on a global scale. Everything evolutionists try to explain away is easily explained when you remember Noah's flood. The great worldwide or global flood would have done everything that we see. It would have created the rock layers, not over millions of years, but almost overnight. It would have created the rock layers, and it would also have buried complex things at the bottom and more simple things near the top. They try to say it's millions of years that did it, but God says, no, it happened when I sent a flood in Genesis chapter 6 through 8. remember, everything that they ever propose goes back to Noah's flood. It answers all of their arguments. Look, we're just getting started. I don't mean tonight, we're about to dismiss. I mean, we're just getting started in this series. So over the next few weeks, and again, I don't want to bore you. I hope it's not boring. But over the next few weeks, we're going to add to this. Next week, we're going to ask the question, well, how old is the earth? If it's not millions or billions of years old, how old is it? And is there any science that points to a young earth versus an old earth? And so I hope you'll stick around over the next few weeks. But as we wrap it up tonight, I just want you to think that there's only two choices on the table. We either evolved by random chance, which means God didn't form us, or else we got here because God said, let there be, and then there was. The two cannot be reconciled. It cannot be God and Charles Darwin. It cannot be God and evolution. There's attempts to do that, and it doesn't work. If Darwin's theory has fallen apart, which I hope tonight I've shown you, then that only leaves God standing here saying, I told you in the beginning, I created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1:1 says that. John 1:3 says, all things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. Colossians 1:16 says, for by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions, rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. God is the creator. There's no middle ground. And I hope tonight that you have a firm conviction that God is the one who made us and everything that we see. And don't bend, don't cower, don't break when people start to tell us, you just don't get science. I think the science we'll see over the next few weeks points to the fact that God is the creator. I want us to have a word of prayer before we dismiss tonight. I'm not going to ask you to stand and have an invitation stuff. It's a little bit different tonight. Now, I will say that in a minute we're going to have our... Thank you once again for tuning in to our live broadcast here at Putman Baptist Church. As always, we appreciate you being a part of our service from wherever you choose to watch. But we want to let you know that if you should ever have any questions about what you've heard in the morning's message, or questions about how to be saved, to know whether or not you're going to go to heaven one day, or you'd like prayer or anything else, we would love to hear from you. Just because you're not here in the building doesn't mean that you're not still part of this fellowship. So please, feel free to give us a call. You can reach me on my cell phone at 426-3706, or you can call the church office, or send us a message right here on the church Facebook page, and somebody will get in touch with you very soon. Thank you again. God bless you, and hope you have a great day.